The orchestra was already seated. The lights were hot. The crowd was packed shoulder to shoulder. And backstage, Frank Sinatra was refusing to sing. 30 seconds passed, then another. Murmurs rolled through the Harlem theater like distant thunder. This wasn't just a concert, it was a benefit for orphaned children. Children who had already lost everything. And now, the man they paid for wasn't coming out. Earlier that night, Harlem had dressed itself in hope. Church leaders filled the front rows. Local businessmen opened their wallets. Mothers brought children who had never seen a star in real life. Sinatra's name alone had sold every seat. His voice was supposed to lift the room, but something went wrong. Behind the curtain. Sinatra sat in his dressing room, jacket still on, cigarette burning low. He wasn't angry, he was calm. The kind of calm that meant a decision had already been made. The promoter begged, the stage manager whispered. Someone mentioned the kids. Sinatra didn't move. Outside, the crowd grew restless. People didn't yet know why the show hadn't started, but Harlem had a sixth sense for disrespect. And this delay felt like one. Then the whispers changed. A man had arrived. No entourage. No announcement. Just a name moving through the backstage hallway like a current, Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't on the program. He wasn't a donor. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near a Frank Sinatra concert. But in Harlem, when Bumpy Johnson walked toward closed door. That door usually opened. The stage manager watched him pass and said nothing. Bumpy stopped in front of Sinatra's dressing room. He raised his hand and knocked. 30 seconds later, the curtain moved. This night was never about Frank Sinatra. That was the part no one backstage seemed to understand. The benefit had been organized for Harlem's orphaned kids whose fathers had disappeared into prisons, alleys, or unmarked graves. Some had lost parents to violence, others to poverty so deep it swallowed entire families without leaving a body behind. For them, this concert wasn't entertainment. It was proof that someone, somewhere, still saw them. Churchwomen had spent weeks sewing donated clothes so the children would look presentable. Local shop owners gave money they couldn't afford to lose. Even men who made their living in the shadows contributed quietly, no names attached, because this was Harlem taking care of its own if the show failed. It wouldn't just be embarrassing, it would be humiliating. Harlem already lived under a microscope. Downtown newspapers loved stories about its crime, its chaos, its danger. A canceled concert for orphaned kids because a famous singer didn't feel like it would become another excuse to paint the neighborhood as unworthy. That was the real tension filling the room. People in the audience didn't know the details yet, but they felt the delay. Mothers tightened their grip on children's hands. Men checked their watches. Every second without music felt like a quiet insult. Backstage, the promoters understood something else. If Sinatra walked away tonight, Harlem would remember, not with protests, not with headlines, with silence. And in Harlem, silence was never empty. It was heavy, carried consequences. That was why the stage manager's face went pale when he heard Bumpy Johnson's name whispered down the corridor. Because Bumpy didn't care about Sinatra's ego. He cared about Harlem's pride. And that meant this delay had already gone too far, Frank. Sinatra had spent his entire career learning one rule. Whoever controls the room controls the outcome. And tonight, he believed that was still him. Inside the dressing room, the noise of the restless crowd barely registered. Sinatra sat back, jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened just enough to show indifference. This wasn't fear. This was calculation. He had walked away from bigger stages than this. Studios, executives, contracts worth millions. Harlem, in his mind, was supposed to wait to Sinatra, Refusal was leverage. He didn't shout. He didn't throw a tantrum. That would have given the situation emotion-weakened position. Instead, he stayed seated, calm, letting the silence do the work. Every passing second increased the pressure outside, not on him. The promoter explained the benefit again, mentioned the children, mentioned donors, mentioned reputations. Sinatra nodded politely, as if listening to weather reports. His issue wasn't the kids, never was. It was control. A disagreement over terms. Over respect, over who had final say. Sinatra believed that if he gave in now, he'd be giving in forever. 2 venues, 2 neighborhoods. 2 people who thought his name could be borrowed without his conditions. In his world, stars didn't bend. They were accommodated. So he waited. What Sinatra didn't fully understand was that Harlem followed a different hierarchy. Fame mattered. Money mattered. Or spectral respect didn't come from billboards or applause. It came from showing up when the neighborhood needed you, outside that dressing room. The delay had already crossed from inconvenience into insult, and Sinatra was still playing by rules that didn't apply where he was sitting. He thought he was holding the line. He didn't realize he was about to meet someone who had drawn that line decades earlier and enforced it without ever raising his voice. Backstage, the calm was gone. The stage manager wiped his hands on his trousers for the 3rd time in a minute. The promoter stopped pretending to check paperwork and started pacing. Every glance at the curtain felt heavier than the last. The orchestra members exchanged looks. Professionals who knew when something was wrong but didn't yet know how wrong. The clock over the stage door kept moving. Each minute past the start time wasn't just lost money. It was lost control. Ushers reported raised voices in the crowd. Not shouting yet, but the tone had shifted. Harlem audiences were patient, but patience had a limit. And everyone backstage knew what happened when people felt disrespected in their own neighborhood. Someone suggested calling the police. The idea died instantly. Uniforms wouldn't fix this. If anything, they'd make it worse. A stalled benefit concert for orphans turning into a police situation was the kind of story that lived forever. Even if the truth died in single quotes, the unthinkable. Canceling, the stage manager snapped his head around. Canceling meant refunds. It meant explanations. It meant telling children in pressed hand-me-down clothes that the night they'd been promised was over before it began. And it meant Frank Sinatra walking out of Harlem without consequence. That was when a runner leaned in and spoke softly. Almost afraid of the words themselves. He's here. No name at first. Just 2 syllables hanging in the air. The stage manager knew immediately. His shoulders stiffened. The promoter stopped pacing. Nobody asked how he'd gotten in or who had let him backstage. Those questions didn't matter. What mattered was this. Problems in Harlem didn't get solved by contracts once Bumpy Johnson was involved. They got solved by presence, down the corridor. Footsteps approached, slow, unhurried, confident. Not the walk of a man rushing to fix a crisis, but of one who knew the crisis had already come to him. The backstage noise fell away as he passed. Because everyone there understood something Sinatra didn't. This delay had just found its answer. Bumpy Johnson didn't announce himself. He never needed to. He moved through the backstage corridor. The way he moved through Harlem without hurry, without permission, without resistance. Men stepped aside before they realized they were doing it. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the air seemed to change, tightening as he passed. Bumpy was dressed simply. Dark suit, clean shoes, hat low, but not hiding. There was nothing theatrical about him, no bodyguards flanking his shoulders, no threats spoken under his breath. His reputation had already arrived ahead of him. and taken care of those details to the people backstage. This wasn't a gangster walking into a concert hall. This was Harlem itself deciding to intervene. Bumpy had grown up watching promises made to his neighborhood and quietly broken. He had seen benefits turn into photo opportunities and charity nights end with everyone leaving except the people who needed help. That was why he'd come tonight. Not for Sinatra, not for applause. For the kids sitting out there, swinging their feet above the floor, waiting for something good to finally happen as he walked. Bumpy took in everything: the tension in the crew's shoulders, the forced smiles, the sound of an orchestra holding its breath. He didn't ask questions. He already knew the shape of the problem. There was a man in a room who believed his name carried more weight than Harlem's pride. Bumpy stopped outside. The dressing room door, the name on the plaque, meant nothing to him. Inside that room was just another man who needed to be reminded where he was standing. Bumpy raised his hand, steady and deliberate, and knocked once. Not loud, not soft. Perfectly measured. The sound cut through the backstage noise. Like a signal, everyone nearby froze, because they understood something that couldn't be written into contracts or explained to outsiders. When Bumpy Johnson knocked, the conversation was already over. The only question left was how quickly the other man would realize it. Inside the dressing room, the knock landed differently. It wasn't urgent, it wasn't aggressive, didn't sound like a man asking for anything. It sounded like a statement. Sinatra looked up from his chair. It's for the first time that night. His expression shifted not to fear, but to alertness. He recognized that kind of knock. Anyone who had survived long enough in his world did. It was the sound of someone who expected to be answered. The promoter hesitated, then crossed the room and opened the door. Bumpy Johnson stood there alone. No smile, no scowl, just steady eyes and a posture that suggested he had all the time in the world. He didn't step forward right away. He let the room acknowledge him first. Let the air settle around his presence. Sinatra rose slowly, smoothing his jacket, instinctively reclaiming his stature. Two powerful men, measuring each other without a word spoken yet. Fame on one side, authority on the other. Bumpy finally stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The room felt smaller. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. Sinatra already knew who he was. Harlem had a way of teaching its lessons quietly, and Sinatra had done enough homework to understand when he'd crossed into someone else's jurisdiction. Bumpy looked around, once at the mirror, the chair, the cigarette burning low in the ashtray. Then his eyes returned to Sinatra. "This won't take long," Bumpy said. His voice was calm, almost polite. That was the most unsettling part, because men who needed to shout were usually unsure. Men who spoke softly had already decided how things were going to end. Outside the door, the hallway had gone silent. No footsteps, no whispers. Just waiting. Inside, two worlds stood face to face. And for the first time that night, Frank Sinatra wasn't the one setting the tempo. The next words spoken in that room would decide whether this night did an embarrassment tour. Legend, no one ever agreed on exactly what Bumpy Johnson said in that room. That was intentional. Bumpy didn't believe in witnesses when authority was being clarified. And Sinatra, to his credit, never corrected the rumors. He understood that some stories gained power by being left untouched. What mattered wasn't the volume of the conversation, it was how quiet it stayed. Bumpy didn't threaten Sinatra. Didn't mention violence. He didn't raise his voice or step into his space. Instead, he spoke about Harlem, what the neighborhood remembered, and what it never forgot. He spoke about the children sitting in the audience, about how they would remember this night for the rest of their lives, about how they would Remember who showed up for the man who didn't? Sinatra listened at some point. Bumpy shifted the conversation away from the concert entirely. He talked about respect, about how borrowed stages came with borrowed responsibility, about how Harlem wasn't a backdrop, it was a community that paid attention. Then Bumpy said something that changed Sinatra's posture. He reminded him that the doors he walked through tonight would still be standing tomorrow. That names traveled fast in Harlem. And that reputations didn't fade just because a man left town. It wasn't a threat, it was a forecast. Sinatra understood forecasts. He had built his career reading rooms before they turned. And suddenly, he realized he had misread this one. The power in the room had shifted without anyone touching a thing. Bumpy finished speaking and adjusted his cuff, as if concluding a business meeting. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "But those kids out there, they were promised a song." He stepped back toward the door. Decide fast. When Bumpy left the room, Sinatra remained standing. And for the first time that night, his decision wasn't about control anymore. It was about consequence. The door closed softly behind Bumpy Johnson. For a moment, Sinatra stood, alone in the dressing room, staring at his reflection. The cigarette in the ashtray burned down to the filter. The silence felt heavier, not strategic, not controlled. Final dot outside. The orchestra waited. Then Sinatra moved. He reached for his jacket and slipped it on, smoothing the sleeves with the same care he used before stepping onto any stage. The promoter looked up, unsure whether to speak or stay invisible. Sinatra didn't acknowledge him. He didn't need commentary. He walked toward the door. When it opened, the hallway seemed to exhale. Someone whispered to the stage manager. The stage manager nodded once and raised his hand. "Places," he said. The orchestra straightened. Instruments lifted. A musician quietly adjusted his music stand, hand shaking just enough to be noticed. 30 seconds, that was all it took. The curtain began to move. Slowly at first, then fully, revealing the stage to a crowd that hadn't yet decided whether to cheer or demand answers. Sinatra stepped into the light for half a heartbeat. The room froze. Then the applause hit, not cautious, but loud and relieved. Not because Sinatra was famous, but because the night had been saved. Mothers clapped with hands held too tight. Children leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide, afraid to blink. Sinatra approached the microphone and paused. He looked out at Harlem, not scanning, not smiling, just taking it in. Somewhere in the wings, Bumpy Johnson stood unseen, already finished with his part in the evening. The conductor raised his baton. Sinatra nodded once. The first note rang out. It's clean and unmistakable. And just like that, a night on the edge of collapse became something else entirely, not because a star decided to sing, but because someone reminded him where he was standing. The concert had started, but the lesson had already been delivered. From the first note, something was different. This wasn't the polished, distant performance Sinatra was known for, the kind delivered to packed houses where applause was expected and emotion was optional. This was slower, measured, almost restrained, as if he understood that the room didn't need to be impressed. It needed to be respected. Harlem listened. The children in the front rows sat perfectly still. Some had never heard an orchestra live before. Others had only heard Sinatra's voice crackling through a radio late at night, borrowed from someone else's apartment. Now it filled the room, warm and close, like it belonged there. Sinatra's eyes didn't drift upward toward balconies or lights. They stayed level, on faces, on rows of people who weren't dazzled by fame, only by sincerity. When he sang about loss, it landed differently here. When he held a note, it wasn't for effect, It was for emphasis. Backstage. Seasoned crew members noticed it. 2. This wasn't a man performing above a crowd. This was a man performing in front of one. The orchestra followed him carefully, adjusting tempo, letting him lead instead of pushing. Between songs, the applause wasn't explosive, it was deep, sustained. The kind that came from recognition, not excitement. Somewhere near the aisle, a woman wiped her eyes and pulled a child closer. A boy kicked his feet in time with the rhythm, smiling without realizing why. For a brief stretch of time, the weight Harlem carried every day eased. Just enough to breathe. Sinatra finished a song and paused longer than usual. He nodded once small. Almost imperceptible. Not to the crowd, to the room itself. And in that moment, something unspoken settled into place. The audience understood. They hadn't just witnessed a performance. They had witnessed a correction. Fame had entered Harlem believing it could dictate terms. It was leaving having learned something else. As the music continued, one thing became clear to everyone listening. This concert would be remembered long after the set list was forgotten.